In this video, we're going to paint a sunset, and this painting is all about creating a nice smooth gradient going from the yellows through reds into the blues, and then dropping in some darker clouds wet in wet. There's a bit of water control required so that the clouds don't run all over the sky and that we get this really nice dark value as well. Before I jump into the painting, I'm going to talk you quickly how I arrived at this particular composition. A couple of weeks ago, we painted a sunset in one of the classes that I attend, not teach, and I got enough confidence to try my own sunset based off that class. So I went through my photo library and then found a few photo references that I thought were worthy contenders for a sunset painting. However, I had something different in mind. What I liked about this one on the left is that we have this big tidal pool here that the sunset reflects into in the foreground, but the sun's sort of hidden behind the clouds at the top, and also the colors are not quite what I had in mind. This one's closer to what I wanted to paint, having a gradient going from an orange yellow color through to the blue at the top, and then have some clouds high in the sky, and then also some silhouette backlit elements in the middle ground. I also wanted to paint it in portrait, so I basically just combined both ideas and did a really rough value sketch, and it's a pretty simple painting in terms of the composition, so I didn't need much. Just wanted to indicate clouds at the top, horizon line about a quarter, maybe a third from the bottom, the headlands coming in from sort of a couple of sides, and then have the beach with a tidal pool. And that's about as difficult as I wanted to make my layout. So let's jump into the painting. As with every ocean scene, you need to get the horizon dead straight. So I'm using the back of a book, could also use a ruler obviously. And then I'm going to translate that value sketch that I just showed you onto the paper, taking a little bit more care, obviously, than my scribbles for the value sketch. And I get the angle of the beach right. And then indicate where I want the tidal pool to go. And then also where that little headland comes in, or some rocks, whatever they are. Just to create a bit of a meandering line through the painting from the bottom up to the horizon. Now I'm going to tape off the horizon line so that when I paint my sky in, it doesn't go onto the water. I want to keep the two parts quite separate. I start with almost pure yellow and a tiny bit of my brilliant orange. So that's a warm yellow and a brilliant orange. And this time I didn't wet my paper. There's going to be plenty of water and moisture by the time I'm done with this gradient. So I have enough water in my pigment for it not to dry brush, but I don't need any more. I don't want it to completely run into each other. I need to keep the layers of colors a little bit separate. So darken the yellow a little bit. I'm now halfway up my sky, and now I'm going to mix in a bit of a warm red. Could be a cadmium red, and I think it actually is. Ideally, I use pigments that are quite transparent. If you start using semi-opaque pigments, you won't get the vibrancy and the luminosity that I want to achieve, because we want the white paper to obviously light up that sky. I'm using a pretty large and natural hairbrush. It's a calligraphy brush. You could use a hake for that, or a soft bristle flat brush, whatever you're comfortable with, but it's got to be a fairly large brush and one that doesn't create lots of streaks. And you can see the pigment is now quite dry. There is a bit of dry brushing happening there, so I could probably have a smidgen more water. But I've moved into my magenta, added that to my yellow-orange mix, and slowly work my way up into the blues, just like a rainbow. Ultramarine blue and a bit of lavender. Lavender is always good for skies. It's got a bit of body in it. Helps solidify the paint a little bit on the paper. but not too much, because otherwise you get milky textures and milky colors. Bit of a jump there, but I'm just adding a bit more blue at the top. I want to make sure that it's dark. My board is on a very slight angle, not very much. And then I'm going to drag a little bit more red through that middle part that was a bit too yellow. I want to make sure there is a transition. The most orange yellow part needs to be at the bottom, and then gradually fade off, going up. This is always a worthwhile exercise to do, practicing your washes, your gradient washes and variegated washes, and making sure that they are nice and smooth and don't have too many stripes through it and no backgrounds. And I'm pretty much going immediately in with my darker clouds. There will be 2 passes on these. This first pass isn't my darkest value yet, but I don't have a lot of water in the pigment because the underlying wash is already quite wet. So for those clouds to stay more or less in place, you can't add more water to it. That's why I also switched to a smaller brush so that I don't pick up a whole lot of water that I'm going to dump into it. That's a recipe for disaster when you paint wet and wet clouds. So I'm now just dropping in or stippling in the cloud formations and trying to create as random and natural occurring kind of pattern as possible. I also adding a bit of red glow to the bottom of those clouds, which will pretty much vanish by the time it's dry. And that's the wonderful stage of any painting here, where you can't go wrong. As long as there's enough moisture, things will just dissolve and get absorbed, and they're quite malleable and changeable. And I'm now coming down with finer streaks. There's perspective in the sky as well, which I'm sure you're aware of. Big clouds at the top, small towards the horizon as they move into the distance. That's how you create the illusion of depth. I forgot my sun. I should have lifted it out while the yellow was still fresh, but it's already settled significantly into the paper, so I can't just put a tissue down and lift the sun out. So I'm going to have to come in with a clean wet brush, loosen up that pigment a little bit, and then lift out a semicircle. And obviously you can decide how far the sun has already disappeared behind the horizon. Now I'm going to push those dark clouds even further by adding more pigment with hardly any water now. You can see how much shine is on my top half of the paper and how it's buckling. So it's got a lot of water in the paper still. So I can go in, but I don't want to drop in any more water. That would start dispersing and probably cause cauliflowers. And as I come down the horizon, as I've been doing all along, smaller shapes and also lighter in value, it's receding into the distance for one, and secondly, it's getting closer to the sun, so the light will push through those clouds more than at the top. So I got to make sure I don't go too far down the page with my dark pigment. And the other thing to keep in mind is not to make it too much like a stripy pattern. Make your strokes going outside of the painting. So a lot of times when you do horizontal lines, it's easy to start inside the frame and not drag it all the way out, and that'll look really weird once you take the tape off. So make sure it extends past the borders. Still not done with those top clouds, because we know how much lighter watercolor dries, and the more water is in there and the many more layers you have on top of each other, the more deceiving it is. It looks really dark right now, but this will lighten up quite significantly. So I just want to make sure I've piled enough pigment, because the last thing I want to do is go over it again. Just lifting it up so you can see it without the reflection of the light. And in case you were wondering why I've got a hockey brush there on the side, that wasn't just for decoration. I knew there was a point in the painting where I needed to just soften out some of the clouds and blur them out a little bit. Some of the edges dried a little bit too hard. And if it's not completely dried yet, then a dry hockey brush is great for just softening some of the uneven strokes. Off comes the tape for the horizon, and the bottom of the sky is dry enough for me to just move it up so that I can attempt a straight line for the ocean as well. As you'll see in a minute, that won't quite work, and I'll have to improvise to fix the problem. But let's focus on the ocean and the reflection of the sun. So I started off with a bit of yellow there, straight under the sun, and I've mixed a warm reddish, slightly purplish color for the water. The water doesn't have to be blue. Obviously, water is whatever color it reflects from the sky. And as always, the values are more important. This could also be more purple. That is up to you how you want to create your mood in the painting. And I'm going to do the puddle first, reflecting some of the sun and also some orangey red sky. And then I'm going to go around it with a slightly darker and cooler color. I always struggle to describe my mixes as I progress with the painting, because at this point I'm sort of just using all colors I've already used. So it's a mix of everything, the reds, the yellows, the blues. I'm now thinking more in values and temperatures. Does it have to be darker and does it have to be cooler to work with what I've already painted? I want to make sure I have enough contrast between the reflection of the sun and the water around it. So I'm going to gently layer that up, also creating some textures of waves. And I thought that the reflection wasn't quite bright enough, so I'm wiping it off a bit with a tissue and then reapply some color. That is always trial and error, so it's hard to follow exactly what I'm doing. You just got to play around and just use this as a direction rather than an instruction. You could see I lifted out a bit of the yellow again with a clean brush and then reapplied the color. This is also the stage where things tend to look a little bit awkward because we haven't got our darks in yet. And as soon as we put in the really dark values, then it will come to life. And again, my hockey brush trick here, you can now probably see a little bit better how that softens things out a bit. And here I'm pulling off the tape and you can see it leaked. We've got a little bit of running up into the sky, so we'll just make another headland in the far distance that I hadn't planned. So I'll let the geologists explain how this just emerged out of the ocean, but it did. Now it's time for the darkest values of the silhouette, the backlit rocks or headlands. And it's a very thick, creamy mix of blues and browns that are put together to create my darkest dark. Always pay attention to how headlands or rocks finish when they go into the ocean. When you have hard edges, when things intersect with each other with sharp and hard edges, the eye is always drawn to it. So, for example, where the rocks end in the water, our eyes will look for details. So that has to look right and realistic. And it's often where things come apart because you keep fiddling until it's totally wrong. So finding the balance between being loose and spontaneous and still manage a good amount of detail and a realism, that is always the challenge. Well, at least for me, and if it's not for you, then leave me in the comments how you do it. Just diluting that same mix a little bit, add a bit of water for the beach. I don't want it quite as dark as the rocks against the bright lit sky, because that's where the main contrast should be. But the beach should also be coherent with the rocks in terms of the color and the value. So it's just a bit lighter. And then I'm going to paint around that tide pool. And I struggled a little bit with making that a satisfying shape. I should have probably taken a little bit more care when I sketched it. I just went, oh yeah, somewhere there, and I'll figure it out when I paint. That can work sometimes, but sometimes it can't. And here I struggled. Especially when the paper starts to buckle a bit. It's kind of hard to keep things straight because, yeah, it doesn't look quite the way that it will once the paper dried and is flat. Watercolor is a constant battle with everything. Why do we do it? Well, I do it because I like to solve problems, and painting watercolors is nothing but problem solving. Time for the second cluster of rocks that's coming in from the left. This will create a nice zigzag line from the bottom of the painting up towards the sun. And from there, the gradient will pull us up into the sky all the way to the top of the dark clouds. I just dragged in a couple of streaks of lavender just to cool down the sand a little bit more. And now I'm strengthening the edge of the tidal pool just to enhance the contrast between the beach and the reflection in it. Also adds a bit of realism and dimension to it. I also want to give the ocean a bit more texture, so I'm just going to drag in a couple of darker waves. Nice, clean and straight lines. They don't have to be completely horizontal. You know, waves can break at angles, but the lines themselves have to be nice and straight. And while I'm in the rhythm of painting straight lines, I'm also going to drag just a few very faint, distant clouds just above the horizon there, going in front of the sun, also to add just that a little bit of depth, because the sun is obviously a little bit further away from us than the clouds. If you lost some of the sparkle of the reflection in the water, then white paint, gouache or titanium white to the rescue. That's what I'm doing here. I just mixed a tiny bit of yellow into it. And that's my painting done. Almost. After it was completely dry, I just thought I needed to strengthen just some of the lines in the foreground. And I didn't think I'd done enough dry brushing on this. So I just add a bit more detail, a few things in the sand that help us read this as the foreground before we get dragged up into the painting all the way to the sun. Let's look at it with a mount on top. I'm pretty happy with the outcome, especially the reflections on the water. I think they turned out great. I hope this inspires you to paint your own sunset. Bye for now.